Washington hasn't confirmed it, and Tehran loudly denies it. But in all probability, Iran was well aware of Hamas's coordinated attack on southern Israel on October 7. This isn't shocking anyone, as neither Hamas in Gaza nor Hezbollah in Lebanon do much of anything without the Iran's go-ahead. After all, Iran calls Israel the little Satan, and the Jewish state in return labels Iran as the greatest threat to its security. But it wasn't always like this. In fact, soon after the creation of Israel, Iran was one of the first nations in the Middle East to recognize it. They were each other's closest allies and even worked together militarily. Iran played an important role in helping Israel win the Six-Day War against its Arab neighbors. And even after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, military cooperation continued for several years as Iran turned to Israel to arm it during its devastating war with neighboring Iraq. But today, the relationship between two countries hangs by a thread, and the prospect of a direct confrontation is not that far-fetched. So what happened? Because if you look at a map, one can reasonably say that two countries were never predestined for everlasting hostility. After all, they have no common borders, no territorial dispute, or economic competition. So what went wrong? How did Israel and Iran go from best friends to sworn enemies? Let's go over that in today's video. But first, please be sure to hit the like button below, as YouTube is not going to be happy with this war-related video. And now, let's start. To understand the complexity of their relationship, first we need to take a quick dive into history's lesson. After World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations entrusted the British to govern Palestine. During this period, Palestine had a minority Jewish population and an Arab majority. The British mandate for Palestine, which began in 1920, aimed at facilitating the establishment of a national home for Jewish people. This ignited tensions between the Jewish and Arab communities. Between 1920 and 1940, Palestine witnessed a significant wave of Jewish immigration. Long story short, Arab demands for independence and resistance to Jewish immigration led to a rebellion in 1937, followed by non-stop terrorism and violence from both sides. Many solutions were considered to bring independence to a land ravaged by bloodshed, but everything failed. Finally, in 1947, the British turned the Palestine problem over to the United Nations. The UN created UNESCO, or the UN Special Committee on Palestine, on May 15, 1947, with representatives from 11 countries. UNESCO conducted hearings and surveyed the situation in Palestine, then issued a report on August 31st, recommending the creation of an independent Arab and Jewish states. Under this proposal, Jerusalem would be placed under international administration. This is where Iran comes back into the story, as Iran was one of the 11 countries that formed the UNESCO. Iran, along with India and Yugoslavia, opposed the partition plan and proposed a single federation of autonomous Jewish and Arab states under a representative federal government in Jerusalem. But the committee rejected Iran's proposal by a 3-7 vote and instead urged for the partition. The partition plan was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1947 by a vote of 33-13, and the State of Israel was established on May 14, 1948. Iran was among the 13 states that voted against this plan, and 2 years later, Iran also voted against Israel's admission to the United Nations. But it had a change of heart in 1950, as Iran became the second Muslim-majority country to recognize Israel as a sovereign state after Turkey. Since its creation in 1948, Israel dealt with an acute security challenge, as it faced a massive and largely hostile region unified by a common religion and a common dislike towards Israel. All four of its neighbors were Arabs, as were the Palestinian Arabs, who were then backed by dozens of Arab and Muslim-majority states beyond them. Safe to say, Israel was little worried about being surrounded by people who didn't like it. So, to deal with this, Israel tried to find weakness among its potential adversaries. Early in its state's existence, this took the form of periphery doctrine, an idea devised by the first Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. The whole idea was to build alliances with non-Arab countries, yet mostly Muslim countries in Middle East as a counterbalance to the Arab states. Chief among these non-Arab partners were Turkey and pre-revolution Iran, both countries who at the time had a common orientation towards the West and had their own reasons for feeling isolated in the Middle East. For Shah's Iran, Israel was perceived as a natural ally for several reasons. Today, Iran's friction with the Arab world is largely framed in religious terms, with Iran being mostly Shiite state versus Saudi Arabia, a major Sunni country. However, back in 1950s and 60s, Iran was more worried about the growing pan-Arabism militant supported by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Soviet Union. At the time, Soviets gave their huge military and economic support to militant Arab regimes as a way for spreading Soviet power and influence across the Middle East. Naturally for Shah, Israel looked like a golden opportunity for gaining the sponsorship of the United States, which was seeking allies in a struggle for both regional and global dominance with Soviet Union. Israel's strength and progress fascinated him, and its conflict with the Arab world and opposition to communist influence in the region further promoted the strengthening of ties. The Shah also hoped that through relations with Israel, Iran would benefit from the United States gaining the support of the American government, media, business community, and the administration. On top of this, there were other specific benefits for both sides in many other fields too. In the aftermath of 1948 war, for example, Iran enabled the use of its territory as a safe passage to Israel for the ancient Jewish community that was expelled from Iran. Iran and Israel also viewed Iraq as a common threat, providing another rationale for cooperation. By 1960s, Israel was supporting Iraqi Kurds fighting the central regime. Meanwhile, Iran also viewed the Iraqi Kurds as Iraqi regime's Achilles heel. That's why Israel and Iran's intelligence organizations, the Mossad and Savak, joined forces to aid the Kurds in their struggle against the Iraqi central government. The Mossad created a formal trilateral intelligence alliance, codenamed Trident, with Iran and Turkey in 1958, with the three countries exchanging intelligence and performing joint counterintelligence operations that would continue to expand until the Islamic Revolution. In addition, Tehran also allowed Israel to use its territory to extend invaluable military support to Kurdish rebellion in northern Iraq, a move that served Shah's goal of weakening Baghdad and asserting Iranian dominance throughout the Persian Gulf. The Shah, who began his career as a mere figurehead and was harshly scrutinized by local powers and superpowers, later emerged as an absolute monarch determined to proceed with his growth plans. His ideology, basing itself on westernization, religious freedom, and nationalism, permitted increasingly greater Iranian and Israeli cooperation. Seeing himself as a benevolent leader following in the footsteps of Cyrus the Great probably reinforced his tolerant approach to religious minorities and his friendship with Israel. He also viewed cooperation with Israel as a springboard for the transformation of Iran into a modern, technologically advanced, and developed nation. That's why he welcomed huge numbers of Israelis into Iran to help with numerous sectors. These included military and security affairs, agriculture support, engineering, and various other fields. The Israeli presence grew so large that Iran had to open a Hebrew language school in Tehran for children of Israeli personnel stationed in Iran. On top of this, flights connecting Tel Aviv and Tehran became a common occurrence, and Iran also became a major importer of Israeli goods and services. Another geopolitical consideration that played a key factor was Israel's dire need for energy sources on one hand, and Iran's desire to expand its oil exports on the other. Without its own oil resources and subjected to an all-Arab economic boycott, Israel had to find alternative energy sources that would meet the demand of its rapidly growing population. Who else other than the non-Arab Iran? Relations in this field were established in 1950s, reaching their peak in the wake of June 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel convinced Iran to jointly establish the Eilat-Ascalon pipeline connecting the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. To conceal their tracks, Iran and Israel established a new company in Panama and Switzerland under a central legal entity known as Trans-Asiatic Oil, which served as the operating base of the top-secret partnership that existed between Israel and the National Iranian Oil Company in late 1970s. Israel's promise of generous returns on Iran's investments in the pipeline matched Iran's desire to establish itself as a dominant player in the international oil market. The Arab oil boycott of 1973, meant to punish the United States and Europe for their support of Israel, further boosted Shah's regime. Iran had not joined the boycott, therefore stood as a major beneficiary. As a result, Iran's oil sale to both Israel and Europe grew dramatically, and with it, country's revenue. Iran also used its oil production to advance its military interests. In 1977, a joint Iranian-Israeli military effort named Project Flower focused on development of advanced missile systems. It was one of 6 oil for arms contracts that countries signed in late 1970s, which were worth an estimated $1.2 billion. Iran paid approximately $300 million in cash upfront and another $250 million in oil, and thus became the financier for several Israeli-led research and development projects. As Israel led the development, Iran started the construction of missile assembly and test facilities, with the understanding that both countries' armies would purchase the new defense system once operational. Little did both countries know how things were about to change. Just as the friendship flowered in response to larger political conditions, it also came to an end because of a larger geopolitical changes. The death of Abdel Nasser in 1970 and the rise of Anwar Sadat led to a warming of relations between Egypt and Iran. Unlike Nasser, the Shah trusted Sadat and supported his Middle East policy. Moreover, in March 1975, Iran and Iraq signed the Algiers Accord, putting a temporary end to Iranian-Iraqi conflict and closing a chapter in Iran-Israeli common support for Iraqi Kurds. In both cases, Israel's strategic value to Iran suffered. Although friendship prevailed and both countries still worked together in many different areas, Iran still found itself, with fewer reasons, to form a strong connection with Israel. Throughout this period of friendship, anti-Israel attitudes continued to flame, particularly among the clergy and anti-Shah and anti-Western elements. Most prominent among these voices was the Ayatollah Khomeini. Already in the 1960s, Khomeini had used Shah's relation with Israel and the United States as a trump card to discredit the monarch and undermine his legitimacy, accusing him of allowing Israel to fully penetrate Iran's economy, military, and political affairs. According to Khomeini, the Shah's relation with Israel and US violated the principles of Islam and threatens Iran's independent values and integrity. In Khomeini's view, the US was the great Satan because it constituted the primary threat to Iran's Islamic character and independence, while Israel was the little Satan as an illegal occupier of Islamic lands and the influencer of US decision-making in the Middle East. When Shah was overthrown during the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and his authoritarian secular regime was replaced by no less oppressive Islamic one, the relationship with Israel was one of the first things to go. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile in France on February 1, 1979 and established the Islamic Republic of Iran, declaring himself as its supreme leader. Within weeks of Islamic Revolution, Tehran severed all ties with Israel, inaugurating a new era in Israeli-Iranian relationship characterized by deadly hostility towards the Jewish state and open calls for its destructions that have persisted to this very day. Iran's post-revolution foreign policy was restless and ideological. The revolutionaries saw the Shah's overthrow not as a final goal in itself, but as a first step towards liberating the wider Middle East from US domination. The Persian Gulf's Arab regimes, backed by the United States, were next stop for the Islamic Revolution. The Islamic Republic focused its efforts on stirring up Shia population in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. However, Iran's efforts to overthrow the old order were largely ineffective and in many ways counterproductive. Faced with the threat of a revolutionary Iran, the Persian Gulf states formed the Gulf Cooperation Council in 1981 and aided Saddam Hussein's military conflict with Iran. There's a common saying that pragmatic interest and common enemies often trump ideology. Well, if we only had $1 for every time this statement was true. When Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in September 1980 seemed to endanger the survival of the Islamist regime, the Islamic Republic quickly realized the value of an Israeli counterweight to its Arab neighbors and was prepared to receive overt military support from the Little Satan in what became known as Iran-Contra affairs. The notorious Iran-Contra deal in mid-1980s involved a bizarre plot in which Israel supplied US-made missiles to Iran in exchange for money. Israel itself had a vested interest in Iraq's defeat, as it viewed Saddam Hussein as a central threat to its security, and a victorious Iraq presented a far more potent challenge to Israel than Iran did at the time. Not only was this deal highly profitable for Israeli arms traders, but the Israeli officers continued to find value in supporting Iran to counter the common Iraqi threat, while leaving the door open for improved relations with Iran in the future. Between 1981 and 1983, it sold an estimated $500 million worth of arms to Iran, most of them paid for in oil. Yet, this episode didn't reduce Tehran's animosity for Israel. Quite the contrary. It helped bring together different Shia groups in Lebanon into one organization called Hezbollah, and gave them training, weapons, and ideas to attack American and Israeli targets. Also, during the Iran-Iraq War, Iran continued to collaborate secretly with Israel on defense issues while ramping up its rhetoric against the Jewish state in public. The regime's painting of Israel as a threat to the Arab world eased Iran's sense of isolation and enhanced its image as a force of resistance. Despite Iran's behavior, Israel benefited from the arms deals, both economically and geopolitically. In addition to making money off the sales, Israel hoped to win favors of moderates in the Iranian regime, who would potentially take power after Khomeini's death and steer Iran towards better relations with Israel. Iran did indeed adopt more pragmatic policies after Khomeini's death in 1989, but they were all short-lived. By 1991, the geostrategic map of the Middle East was significantly transformed by two critical events, namely the collapse of Soviet Union and the demolition of Iraqi army in 1991 Persian Gulf War. The historians also claim that the real turning point in Israeli-Iranian relationships was not in 1979, but in 1991, as the end of the Cold War also ended the Iranian-Israeli Cold Peace. With the Soviets out of the picture and defeat of their nemesis Saddam Hussein's regime in the Gulf War, Iran once again turned against the United States and its regional ally Israel. Taking the banner against the resistance of the Zionist regime, the Iranian regime started expanding its influence in the region by engaging in covert activities in Arab Sunni countries and supporting terrorist groups including Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Throughout the 90s, the rhetoric between Tehran and Jerusalem became increasingly hostile and threatening, as Iran took place of Iraq as the most significant strategic threat to Israel. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iranian-backed terror cells all carried out the Islamic regime's battle against Israel and Jews worldwide to devastating effects. But above all, decision-makers in Jerusalem were greatly alarmed by Tehran's determined quest for nuclear weapons the decades after the Iran-Iraq War, which in their mind poses an existential threat to Israel. Initially, the new government was uninterested in the nuclear program started by Shah, but the ongoing war with Iraq forced them to change their mind on the issue, and by mid-1980s, Tehran had resumed its nuclear efforts in considerable strength. Although it was under Netanyahu that the presumed Iranian plan to develop nuclear weapons emerged as a primary military concern, it was his predecessors, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, who began to drum into Israeli public the danger that Iran supposedly posed to Israel and international peace. By the following decade, the Israeli-Iranian conflict became well-established and visible. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq led to the defeat of long-standing Iranian adversaries like Taliban and Saddam Hussein, which only resulted in widespread regional perception of growing Iranian influence. The Israelis started to see Iran as the cause of many conflicts in their region because they realized Iran's role in strengthening non-state groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, responsible for threatening stability in areas bordering Israel. The election of Iranian President Ahmadinejad in 2005 and his inflammatory anti-Israel rhetoric and Holocaust denials only deepened Israeli fears of Iran. What further added fuel to the fire was the revelation of the extent of Iran's nuclear weapon program. By the end of 2011, even US President Barack Obama, who had been trying to appease Iran, was pushed to impose strict sanctions on Tehran due to congressional pressure and fear of a potential Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. The European Union also imposed several sanctions, following which, on November 24, 2013, an agreement known as the Joint Plan of Action, or JPOA, was signed between Iran and major world powers. Under the agreement, Iran agreed to limit some of its nuclear activities for 6 months in exchange for $7 billion in sanctions relief. This deal marked a significant shift in international community's approach to Iran, moving from dismantling its nuclear weapons program to extending time it would take Iran to build a nuclear weapon, while leaving its nuclear infrastructure largely intact. After nearly 2 more years of negotiations, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was reached on July 14, 2015. And despite President Obama's optimism about the agreement, it had some significant loopholes that could allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons within 10 to 15 years. Unable to prevent the signing of JCPOA, the Israeli government intensified its covert efforts to stop Iran's nuclear weapon program and urged major powers to reconsider the agreement. These efforts bore fruit on May 8, 2018. When President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA agreement and reinstated some of the sanctions lifted by the Obama administration. But the main reason for the current conflict stems far greater than just Iran's nuclear program. There are also other sources of conflict between Israel and Iran, which are going on in form of proxy wars all across the world. While Iran and Israel haven't directly fought each other, the Iran-Israel proxy wars have been part of a broader regional conflict in the Middle East for many decades. Both sides, through the use of proxies, allies, and other factions, have worked to damage and undermine each other and have made existing wars in the Middle East worse, especially in nearby places like Syria and Lebanon. So, what does the future look like for both these countries? With Iran's ambition rekindled in the wake of Iran-Iraq war, and gaining a major push after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime and shooting to unprecedented heights due to the Arab upheavals during the 2010, that seeks to surround Israel with massive missile and UAV bases not only from Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, and Syria, but also from faraway Iraq and Yemen. This situation has created a tense standoff where both Iran and Israel are reluctant to start a major war. Iran is cautious because Israel has a powerful air force, a strong defense system against missiles, and is believed to have nuclearly armed submarines. On the other hand, Israel is well aware of the significant threat posed by Iran's large missile arsenal, especially the estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles held by Hezbollah. While this tense balance has prevented a full-scale war between the two countries so far, there's still a possibility that things could escalate if Iran gets closer to obtaining nuclear weapons. You see, from Israel's perspective, one thing is clear. The rise of a nuclear Iran is too grave a danger, and Israeli leaders no longer view the peace process as a primary way in stopping Iranian influence. Given Iran's actions and attitudes, they now believe that curbing Iranian influence is the key to resolving Israel's dispute with its Arab neighbors. Iran's view of Israel as a direct rival has also solidified in the recent light. The regime wants Iran as Middle East's ascendant power and increasingly views Israel as an obstacle to its ambitions. The past doesn't always predict the future, but good relationship Israel had with Iran when Shah was in power shows that the current hostility isn't set in stone. 44 years ago, when Iran had a revolution, it changed the Middle East. Perhaps another revolution in Iran could do it again. But then again, given the dangerous nature of today's landscape, it's wishful thinking. But why not? We should always hope for the best. The world is already in pieces with so much going on. A little wishful thinking always helps, right?
Lastly, we have something special to share with you guys. We always wanted to do merch, but not stupid clothes with our logo on it. We wanted to do something unique that relates to geopolitics. And today, we finally have something like that. First, the thing we are most excited about, scratch-off maps. We have two different versions, the world map and the USA map. On the world map, you can scratch off countries you have visited, showcasing your travel history to others, and also as a way to remind yourself of happy memories you made during your world travels. And it's the similar idea with the US map. You can scratch off states you have visited, but this time it will reveal a cool artwork unique to each state's culture. You can check out the full collection by clicking the link down below in description or scanning the QR code on your screen.